Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sasha Thompson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of DEI After 5. If you have followed me for any length of time, you know that I'm always talking about wellness and self-care and making sure that we take care of ourselves as we do this work. And so as I was preparing for this particular episode, I wanted to continue that conversation and really talk to someone that can help us really think about, okay, what are some of the things that we can do? And so today, my guest is Dr. Ayanna Abrams, and she is going to talk to us about setting boundaries. So Dr. Abrams, Dr. Ayanna, welcome. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me, Sasha. I'm excited to chat.
Yes. So first of all, tell us a little bit about your practice and what you do.
Sure. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist in Atlanta, Georgia. I have been in practice going on 10 years this year. And it's a solo mental health practice where I see individuals, groups, and couples focusing on, a wide range of mental health concerns. So anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, other mood symptoms. I work with students. I work with medical professionals. I work with entrepreneurs. And I work with couples. And I also have a branch of my practice that focuses on corporate wellness.
Love it. And so, when I was, again, preparing for this episode and talking to folks around like the different things that were important around self-care and wellness, your name came up as the quote unquote queen of boundaries. Right? Like, oh, you want to talk about boundaries? Dr. Ayanna, that's who you need to talk to. So tell me a little bit about like why boundary setting is so important.
Boundary setting or boundary setting practice is typically what I call it, right? Is really fundamental to healthy relationships. And the reason that it's fundamental is because it offers and allows this practice, right? In a way where people in relationships can develop intimacy while also knowing how to differentiate themselves from each other. And that is something that we are not taught from a very young age. So by the time we are, in grade school and then moving into college and young adulthood and, our significant relationships, right, as we are adults, a lot of people struggle, right, with even knowing what boundaries they want to set and then how to access them and how to practice them in their most important relationships. And it creates a lot of distress when we don't have the boundaries that we need to feel healthy, to feel protected, to feel seen, to feel heard in our relationships. And that's why I call it a practice, because it is an ongoing way to get your needs met in all of your relationships.
I love that. And so most of the folks that listen to this show are DEI practitioners, diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners, or kind of in the space, maybe role adjacent, I will say, so they may not be doing that work, but something similar to it. And something that I always hear is, it's a couple of things, but the one thing that really comes to mind is people are so passionate, so connected to the work, so frustrated because higher ups aren't hearing or listening to what they're saying, or they're having to explain things that they don't necessarily want to explain. And it becomes this very unhealthy relationship, right? For lack of a better term. And so talk to us a little bit about, for practitioners in particular, those that are in corporate spaces, the importance of setting some of those boundaries, right? Because those are relationships.
Absolutely. And what I think is really important about, and the initial kind of stages, right, of creating your own boundary practice that's unique to you, is the self-boundary piece, right? And oftentimes it's difficult to set boundaries with others when we don't have self-awareness, right? And insight enough into what our needs are, what are things that happen that violate our needs, how do I tell when my needs are getting met, what does my body tell me? And that is the core. You need that information before, right, you can more effectively set boundaries in your relationships with other people. So it really starts with self. And oftentimes what we see, when we are in workspaces and workplaces, is that those same areas that's difficult to kind of navigate boundaries and kind of assertiveness with other people are some of the things that we already struggle with in other parts of our lives. So the first step is around that self-awareness, to know what my limits are, what my needs are, what I like and what I don't like. What are the conversations that I feel not only comfortable in, but also safe within, and more right. And that really ties into DE&I work, right? That oftentimes these are practices around how we access safety, right, in our various communities, and how we access that in our workspaces and meetings and groups and subgroups and affinity groups, right? All of that is about safety, psychological safety, cultural safety, emotional safety. And if we are not aware, right, of what are the practices, what are the settings, what are the words and tones of voice that allow us to feel safe, then we're going to really struggle being in spaces like that have just so many layers, right, of human connection, right, and human dynamics.
You just gave me so much to unpack because, I want to, I'm gonna go down one path and I'll come back and I'll go down another path.
Okay.
So, you talked about that self-awareness is kind of that first stage. So once people are kind of aware of understanding their likes, dislikes, even some of their triggers,
Yes.
right? Because I think that that's important in this space too, is understanding and knowing your triggers. What's kind of what's the next step in that process?
Well, the next step is the practice, right? And what feels so difficult about the practice is because it requires risk, right? And we're so wary of taking these risks, right? Even with ourselves and in our relationships. But this kind of practice requires risk. The only way in which you can get more confident is to practice. The only way, right, that you will learn is to do. So it requires kind of moving through a lot of your discomfort to really realize, okay, well, how much of what I'm experiencing is discomfort? How much of it is pain? How much of this is injury, right? That's also part of the self-awareness that you'll be gathering, right? But it does require you to practice, right? To see what's happening, what comes up for you, what shows up in conversation, and then you use that knowledge to continue to build your practice. But it means you have to begin taking the risks. To be wrong, you have to be willing to take the risks to not feel great, and to learn how to recover and cope in some of those moments. You have to be willing to take the risks to be accountable, right? Particularly in this space, right? If someone says, like, hey, I don't like what you said, something felt offensive, something felt off in some way. So it also requires a level of humility, right? That you don't know everything, right? And it requires a level of grace to say, I am practicing something new, right? Those are those next steps. That's why it's oftentimes I will hear a lot of shame and frustration with ourselves that we don't have this kind of, solid, perfected boundary practice. And I'll hear frustration, right, and resent with other people that they don't, respect our boundaries. But there's really a lot that can go into what it means to really set up an effective practice of boundary setting and assertiveness in different ways.
You know what? I'm hearing something else too. As you're talking, I just recall all the conversations of hearing, particularly leaders in this space, talking about diversity and inclusion. I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to do the wrong thing, right? And so they don't do anything. They're frozen in that. And it's like, how do you take that awareness to action? And so it's that practice that you're talking about, is you're going to have to do something and learn through that process of, okay, if you say the wrong thing, it's not the end of the world, right? Like, you can always recover from that. And but it's, what are you learning in that process? And so part of this boundary setting is also pushing your boundaries a little bit too.
Pushing your own limits, right, into those, there are these zones of growth and zones of change and zones like,
Yes.
right. So stepping out of, again, if you are if you are honest and if you are sincerely willing to learn, right? Because I think what also happens, particularly in this space, is that people say, and we've heard it so much across, DE&I practice, but specifically in these past 2 years, I'm here to learn. I'm here to
Mhm.
learn. I'm here to grow. I'm here to listen. And then when you offer people things, it's like, no, don't say that to me though. I want to learn other stuff. I want to learn it in a nice way. I want you to be polite, right?
Say it in this way.
I want to feel good while I'm learning, right? I want to feel like I'm, developing something. Like I want to feel expansive, right, when I'm learning. So it's like I said, it's also that that willingness to engage in, what that practice might feel like for you, and recognizing this is all information, this is all data. Even if it
Mhm.
doesn't feel great, even if it feels unpleasant, that is important for part of my practice, right? And the harder truth is that depending on how you are practicing, who you are practicing with, what spaces you are practicing within, that some of those risks are greater than other risks. So also you being able to tease apart what risks are kind of lower stakes, higher stakes, and kind of gradually
Mhm.
maybe building up in some ways. But also knowing that and you had mentioned the word, kind of recovering, right, from some of these risks might also be a process that doesn't involve another person. So what I'll hear and see come up oftentimes in DEI space is that there is somebody who's practicing something and they do say something that is harmful, right, to someone else or to a group. And there might be some people in that space that can still engage in the relationship with them. And there will be some people, right, that they have the right to do this, say, you know
Mhm.
what, that crossed my boundary, and that is it. I do not need to continue to engage with you. And oftentimes, what I see in the difficulties of a boundary setting practice, and clients ask me this all the time, people on social media ask me this all the time. They say, how do I set this boundary and make sure that they don't get upset? How do I say
Mhm.
this without them getting mad? How do I say this without them rejecting me? And I am consistently offering them is that you're stuck because you're trying to control the part two that you actually have no control
No
with.
control.
All
Yes.
you can
Yes.
do is offer, right, your practice, your assertiveness, your honesty, your integrity. That's all that you can do. But because we are so fearful, right, of what
Mhm.
comes with the risk, oftentimes we don't take the step because we can't guarantee what happens next, right? And that is something that's a more kind of global thing. We want control over everything. That is literally what our brains want, right? So you
Yeah.
are not wrong or bad for wanting that. But oftentimes that is where most of us get stuck. I
Yeah.
want to control that you still like me, that you understand what I'm saying, and you understand my intent, you understand my heart, that you understand all of these things. And oh no, I can't control that they will see, right, my heart in all of
Mhm.
this. So I'm just not going to make a move at all. It really limits, right, your practice.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Like, I always say, like, what is in the sphere of your control?
Mm-hmm.
Because I can't control
Mm-hmm.
people's reactions. I can't do any of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I can do though is if I realize that I've crossed someone's boundary,
Mm-hmm.
how I react to that,
Yes.
right? Like I can control that. I can be apologetic. I can, offer some way to heal that
Mm-hmm.
relationship. But I cannot sit in the discomfort of feeling or knowing that I've harmed someone and genuinely feel like, okay, oh well,
Oh well.
I harmed them,
Yeah. Yeah. And
right?
it sounds like it's something that most people know and understand, that you can't control other people, but at their core, many
It's so
people do
tough.
not understand and or practice that. We really do as a community believe that we have control over other people. So it really requires us to engage in that, whether it's a grieving or whether it's an acceptance that you really cannot control other people's feelings, emotions, mindsets, what they do with their feelings, emotions, or mindsets.
Mhm.
Ideally, it can offer you some room. Ideally, it can offer you some space to focus on yourself. But as a culture, we are very focused on controlling people's responses. Very, very focused on that.
Yeah. So I want to go back down the path and go back up the other path that I
Mhm.
was
Okay,
going thinking
continue.
about when you were talking. And it was around psychological safety
Mm,
because I do a lot of work in that space. And as we're having this conversation, that's one of the pieces that I hear so much from clients. It's
mm.
first of all, they'll call me because they're like, someone said our team isn't psychologically safe.
We don't know what to do with that. We don't know what that means.
Right. They're like, We just need to fix it. Okay. So, and we talk about boundaries, we talk about people showing up as their authentic selves, but I'm like, I don't know if people really know what that means when they say that, or if they genuinely mean it. And so there's a lot of disconnects that happen, and people's expectations of what psychological safety is, right? And people's roles in that. And so I want to talk to you about, as you're going into corporate spaces or as we're doing diversity and inclusion work, and these are very sensitive topics to so many people, it's difficult to say we're going to create a safe space, right? I think that's such a misnomer, because we cannot ensure that it's going to be safe for everyone.
Yes.
And so as you're doing this work and we're talking about boundaries, what are some things that practitioners need to keep in mind as they are trying to do this difficult work within teams or within organizations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That as practitioners kind of moving into or moving within, right, a lot of these spaces, these are questions that are for the people who you are working with, right? That we can't determine what someone else's needs are. And again, that's actually another kind of cognitive mechanism that we tend to engage in, right? Is that this mind reading, right? That I know what your needs are because I am at this level, I've done this training, I've done these things, without actually talking to people, right? And a way to increase psychological safety in any kind of space is actually listening to what someone is saying. Right. And not listening to respond, not listening to rebut, not listening to, kind of prove to them that this is what's already happening there. And look at all these things and all these programs we do once every 2 years. Right. But actually listening to what somebody says and doing your own work to be able to tolerate when they give you feedback that doesn't feel so good. Right. That's where some of the humility comes in. But first you have to actually listen to people. Right. And even before you can listen to them, you have to offer them space to share. And offer them full space to share what it is and whatever it is that they are coming with, right? Oftentimes what I'll see in workspace in the workplaces is that the office space to share, but it's really, rigid or kind of limited space. You can only talk about these things in this way with this person, open door policy, but only if, you're giving me mild feedback about things. Email me anytime, but not when you have a problem with anything, right? So there are all these ways that we talk about openness, right? But people begin to feel less and less safe when they realize the space is not as open. The space is not as affirming. The space is not as, kind of proactive in acknowledging what is going on or what has not happened or taking responsibility for things. Those are all the things that increase psychological safety, right? Which is how safe someone feels mentally, emotionally, even kind of behaviorally, like relationally in a space to be their full selves. And I think workspaces, and this is shifting very, very slightly, it's still a long way to go. Workspaces have a lot of rules. They have their own culture related to leadership and related to history. But there's also a culture of certain industries, right? There's also a culture of certain offices. There's also a culture of certain cities and work. So with all of these rules, right, what does that mean for someone to come in as their whole selves if we also say, be your whole self, but don't dress like that. Don't
right in this box.
This. Don't talk about these things. Work more than this. Answer my like that actually undermines safety, right? So we think about all these ways in which a lot of these companies, they got it on their, their front pages now, psychological safety, all these things. But when you have so many rules that don't allow the totality of someone to show up in that space as themselves, then we've already got some issues right there.
Yeah. Like when I do this work, one of the biggest issues that comes up is trust, right? Because I hear you, I see what the website says. I'm not seeing that. Like there's a disconnect between actions and words here. And so you're asking me to be my authentic self, but I'm not seeing that. Or what I'm seeing is people being ridiculed, punished in some way when they speak up or speak out, right? And against the status quo.
Yes.
So you can be yourself within these parameters, within this box,
Yes.
which is the total opposite of psychological safety.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think when there are implicit ways in which that is communicated and explicit ways in which that is communicated, that you don't have to have these experiences directly, right? To have your head on a bit of a swivel where you see, like you said, where you see the pipeline of how things trickle down. You see what conversations look like about certain people who say certain things or show up in certain ways, or ask for certain things, or acknowledge, right, things that are happening in conversations, or acknowledge lack of safety in some ways. So even if you are not on the even if you were not in the conversation, if you are CC'd on that email thread, you see all of these things, right? You see all the impact of those things, and that can also impact your sense of safety in a workspace. If I see that that is how you talk to that person, or that is how you started leaving them off of emails, or that is how you include or kind of don't include them in projects and all those kinds of things, then why wouldn't you do that to me?
Yeah.
And I think the other piece that even when people are beginning at different companies, depending on what identities you already hold, you might already not feel safe moving into certain spaces. So oftentimes, right, we're already coming in with our own notions, right, of who and where we are safe. And a lot of workspaces don't look like our communities. And I think that also impacts how safe you can begin to feel when you're at a space, but also what these workspaces also need to do, right, to be able to meet you where you are, versus you need to meet us where we are. But that means that you have to access and honor people's identities, right, with where they are showing up when they begin at whatever company or wherever they are.
See, again, you give me stuff and it's like my mind is like all over the place, because first thing, like as you were talking and we're talking about, seeing what happens to people, I started thinking about generational trauma.
Yes.
And I'm a very visual person, and what immediately came to mind, and it reminds me of I think it's John Graham's book that compares the corporate space to like the modern day plantation. What would happen, right, if somebody stepped out of line, the master would bring all the slaves out, punish one to make sure that everybody else knew what happened, right? So you wouldn't act in that way. And so how that has transpired through the generations, now that we're in corporate spaces, we're just wearing suits and ties, but it's the same mental model.
Same
right?
behavior.
Same behavior. And then the other thing that you said just now that triggered for me. So I do the 4 stages of psychological safety through leader factor. And I always share, stage 1 is inclusion. Stage 2 is learning. Stage 3 is contribution. Organizations hire you, wanting you to contribute immediately, but they haven't done the work to make sure that you feel included or that you learn the culture. And so it's exactly what you just said. It's a two-way street. It's not just an employee coming in to do the work. Organizations have to do the work as well too, to make sure that these environments are accepting of whoever I am, right? I feel included. I feel valued, seen, and heard. I'm allowed to learn and grow and make mistakes, right? Because we're still kind of in this learning process.
We're human. Yeah.
We're human. We're not robots.
And that's what makes it a relationship, right? That we are both willing to do the work, right? So that we can continue to access safety and whatever we are generating here, versus I need you to do all of the work because I'm up here. I've already done my stuff in whatever ranks I kind of came through. So you need to show up and do all of these things. You need to violate your own boundaries to prove to me that you deserve to be here, right? That does not create psychological safety.
No, and we're not pushing out widgets, right? So again, it's this connection, it's this relationship between organizations and their employees that has been missing. And I think that's part of why we're seeing this great resignation right now, is because people are setting boundaries.
Yes.
They are identifying, okay, this is what I like and don't like. This is what I need and don't need. And if this place is not, they want me to show up authentically and be my authentic self, and I'm asking for these things that I need, and you're saying no, then I'll go someplace that's going to allow me to do that. And so I think that's a big part of what's happening right now in a lot of these corporations.
I agree.
Is that human element that has been placed on a shelf for so long is now a top priority.
Mm-hmm. Those
Right?
soft skills, right? That we have
Yes.
given attention to for so long. Even calling them soft skills is a whole other right thing. But what does it mean to practice empathy, to practice humility, to learn about your own biases that show up in all these different ways, right? To engage in your own work, which is not reading a book and going to a book club. That can be part of it, right? But what does it mean to actually steep yourself in your own work, right? Your own kind of deeper work, so that it does have a different impact in how you are showing up in the workplace, because those are still relationships.
Yes. And I'm gonna do a little bit of a pivot because one of the things that as we've been talking that comes up is a word that I talk about a lot in my work, and I know you have a piece of your practice that does this, but I talk about vulnerability. And for leaders to start building trust with their employees or with their teams is to be vulnerable. Tell stories of mistakes that you've made. Tell stories of what you went through in this process, because no one starts out on a pedestal, right? So it's hard work to get there and to show the human side of that to people and help them as they're going through their process. And so I know you have a program called Not So Strong. So I want to hear a little bit more about that. And I know that vulnerability is a big part of that.
Sure. Yes. And while it's not focused on the workplace, right, it trickles into the workplace. So Not So Strong, I co-founded that with my college roommate, best friend. She's a psychiatrist up in Charlottesville, Virginia, Dr. Kimberly Sanders. And essentially this came about from our personal friendship. This came about when she was messaging me someday about something that was going on with either both or one of her children at the time, and just how stressful it was. And it opened up this conversation. I think she said at some point, like, I wish I didn't always have to be this strong. And I was like, oh, well, what if you don't have to be, right? Then when we're talking about this, I wish we just didn't have to always, as Black women, kind of holding this armor, right, of needing to figure out all the things. And in our being able to recognize that and the intimacy, right, that we were able to create in our friendship, right, by engaging in that kind of vulnerability, wanting to be able to offer not only spaces, right, for Black women to practice vulnerability, but also a learning process. What we see all over the place is be vulnerable, books on just being vulnerable, but without a sense of safety, right? Without clarity, without self-awareness, that vulnerable practice, right, is really shallow. And oftentimes it's not vulnerable. It's not vulnerability. It's storytelling. And those are two really different things. But also helping, Black women, understand the nuances, right, of, ways in which vulnerability can help us, deepen intimate relationships, create the relationships that we want to experience with ourselves and with other people, but also, right, given our unique intersection, right, of race and gender, ways in which vulnerability can actually be harmful for us, and how do we kind of navigate that dance and build community around the dance of vulnerability, right? Because historically, vulnerability for Black women was not safe to offer, right? I'm not going to offer you spots or points of my body and or my life that you might take advantage of. And that's historically what happened day in and day out, right? 2000s, millions of Black women. So also wanting to offer a lot of grace and compassion, right? That vulnerability is difficult for a reason. Vulnerability has not been safe for you, but how do we also help you learn what is safe and what's not safe for you, who is safe and who is not safe for you, and how to take care of yourself, right, as you're engaging in that learning process, but really moving people through a process and a practice of it, versus what we hear, again, like I said, what we hear all the time is be vulnerable. And I really would not recommend it based on certain identities, based on certain workspaces, to start telling all your business to people at work, right? Because what we see for people with identities that have historically been oppressed or marginalized or ignored, is that they're really penalized for vulnerability, right? Their work ethic is seen as lesser. Their professionalism is seen as lesser. They're seen as being angry. They're seen as being irritable, like all these things that come up. And conversations about vulnerability don't tend to have that nuance. So Dr. Kim and I offer that space.
I love that you all do that. And the caveat for me and listening to you was, I prefaced mine with saying I do that with leaders, and there's potentially, for the majority of their white male leaders that I'm having that conversation with, because, and it's exactly what you said, the level of risk is different for them. And so it's understanding the differences and the nuances of that as well too. So I think that what you all are doing is absolutely beautiful, because particularly for Black women, we hold on to that cape, and sometimes we need to let it go. And it's difficult to do that in a safe way. And so I appreciate that. And so my last question for you, because this work is difficult and challenging and taxing, and I know especially kind of where you sit, you're taking in a lot of the world's work, right? All the challenges of the world, and so
on top of my own stuff, right?
right, because we have lives too. So what do you do to take care of yourself? What do you do to fill your cup and kind of replenish?
And it's really interesting you asking that question, because depending on the time of year, you might get a different answer, right? But these days, what I find, really important for me to do and practices to cultivate is I'm historically a runner, so getting back into running. So using my body in different ways. And when I was originally running, I wasn't building in, strength or yoga or kind of things like that to also engage in lower intensity work. So in incorporating that, it's actually really allowed me to attune to my body in a totally different way that I didn't believe was worth it enough. I'd be like, if you're not sweating, then it's not a workout. And it was all this kind of hardcore stuff. And I was just getting tired. I am tired. I don't know what happens when you turn 37, but it has happened. So, right. So offering other ways. A few years ago, I've, which I think is many of us, really, really poor sleep hygiene for years and years and years. And it was really beginning to affect me in terms of just general functioning, anxiety, kind of work concentration, all those things. So I'm really serious about my sleep. And it's important to be serious about, but I'm really serious about my sleep for the most part. Obviously, there are some nights that'll get me, but really making sure that I get my 7 to 9, right? So that I'm functioning the ways in which I want to function throughout the day. I am big on socializing and social interaction, whether obviously it's mostly virtual for me now, but that is with my family, that is with peers, that is with my partner, making sure that I am emotionally and psychologically connected, right, to people who I love and people who support me. I surround myself with people like that. I surround myself more specifically with Black women. I think that has always been a part of my journey and my life, not only throughout childhood, kind of adolescence, but what it's meant for me in my career, to have mentors in that way, to have peers who are also my mentors in that way, and to also just remain connected to Black women in the psychological space has really grounded me. And I don't get too far from Black women. You never see me too far from Black. You look left and you look right. It's somebody is here, and that is something that is a practice that I learned early on. That is part of my foundational care for myself. But do I also watch a lot of TV? I sure do. I'm all caught up on Bel Air. I'm all caught up on, a million little things, right? So for me to also strike a balance between that, and boundary setting is also part of that, right? How many clients I'm seeing within a week, when I am scheduling certain clients, right, kind of based on their clinical needs, right? I don't schedule certain clients back to back to back because that was having an effect on me. When I end my work day, how I bring in creativity in my workday, right? Those are all parts of me taking care of myself, because it is a lot of heavy lifting and I need other ways to be able to access other parts of myself. So building some of that in, going on vacation next week, like all of that is part of my care.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Ayanna. And how can people get in contact with you?
Perfect. I always say that I run my mouth the most on social media. So on Instagram, I am at Dr._Ayanna_A. That's at Dr._AYANNA_A. The name of my practice and my website is Ascension Behavioral Health, where you can find information about my clinical practice, ways I work with couples, ways I work with companies. But most of what I'm engaging in and what I'm thinking about and what I'm offering to the community is going to be on Instagram.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today. And just want to thank Everyone that has either listened or watched this, I hope you were able to take away a couple of nuggets from this conversation. And as always, you can find us here. You can find us on podcasts, on YouTube. Just find us everywhere. Tell us what you're thinking about these episodes. We love to hear from you. And as always, we will see you next time. Have a good one.